When someone betrays you, the initial shock can feel like the ground has been pulled out from beneath you. You question your judgment, your worth, and the very reality you believed in. But when that betrayal comes from a narcissist, the experience becomes even more disorienting because it isn't just a moment of hurt. It's the unraveling of a pattern you couldn't see while you were inside it. Narcissists don't simply break trust, they distort it, manipulate it, and take advantage of it, all while believing they are untouchable. They move through life convinced that consequences are for other people, that emotions are weaknesses, and that the people who care for them will always be there no matter how deeply they wound them. What they never anticipate is the quiet shift that happens when the person they underestimated finally steps back. They have no idea that their betrayal, the very thing they thought would keep them in control, becomes the turning point that changes everything. Not for you, but for them. Because the moment you begin to see the truth, the moment you stop engaging, their world begins to crack in ways they never expected. They believe breaking you would elevate them. What they never realized is that betraying you would ultimately lead to their own downfall while becoming the beginning of your liberation. A narcissist betrays you not because you deserved it, but because their internal world is built on entitlement, superiority, and emotional emptiness. When you look closely, betrayal is almost predictable with them. They move through relationships as if people are objects, sources of attention, validation, admiration, or usefulness. This sense of entitlement makes them believe they are always justified in doing whatever serves their image or ego in the moment. They do not weigh the emotional cost to others because they lack the capacity or willingness to genuinely empathize. For them, the world is divided into those who can give them something and those who cannot, and they betray when they think the person they're with will tolerate it, overlook it, or be too afraid to walk away. Their superiority complex amplifies this behavior. When someone believes they are exceptional, special, or above consequences, betrayal becomes effortless. They assume you will be there no matter what, that you will forgive because you always have, or that you are so emotionally invested that you will stay even while hurting. This inflated self-view shields them from self-reflection. They rarely question whether their actions are harmful. Instead, they rationalize, rewrite, or blame shift. Betrayal to them is not a moral failure, but a strategic move to secure supply, attention, or momentary excitement. They often mistake your kindness for weakness and your empathy for naivety, confirming their belief that they can act without accountability. Their emotional disconnection plays an even deeper role. A narcissist's emotional landscape is shallow, inconsistent, and self-serving. They cannot bond in deep, secure ways, so betraying you does not create the same internal conflict it would in someone with a healthy emotional framework. They may mimic remorse or guilt if it benefits them, but the root issue remains that they do not feel responsible for the emotional damage they cause. This emotional detachment becomes the perfect soil for betrayal because they move through relationships without forming the kind of attachment that restrains destructive behavior. Ultimately, their belief that consequences will never reach them is what drives their decisions. They operate in a fantasy world where they are untouchable, admired, and always right. They expect others to absorb the pain while they move on unscathed. But this belief is an illusion. Narcissists betray because they think no one will ever leave, no one will expose them, and no one will grow beyond them. They could never imagine that their own entitlement would become the trigger that unravels everything they once took for granted. Your pain after a narcissist's betrayal is real, heavy, and valid. It comes with confusion, self-doubt, and a deep sense of being blindsided. But it's essential to understand that what they did reflects their internal dysfunction, not your inadequacy. A narcissist's betrayal does not happen because you were unworthy, unlovable, or not enough. It happens because they operate from a distorted emotional framework rooted in insecurity, fragility, and an insatiable need for validation. When they hurt you, they are acting out patterns that existed long before you came into their life. And those patterns will continue long after you leave. In their world, relationships are transactional, and other people's feelings are optional. That means their betrayal says everything about who they are, not who you are. When someone lacks empathy, they cannot truly comprehend the emotional weight of their actions. They may understand logically that betrayal wounds people, but the lack of emotional depth makes it impossible for them to feel the gravity of it. This emotional disconnect creates an environment where hurting someone becomes effortless. They don't pause to consider how their choices impact the person who trusted them because their focus is always on what benefits them in the moment. Your capacity to love deeply and genuinely was never something they could match. Instead, they saw it as something they could take advantage of, leaving you questioning your worth while they walk away from the damage they created. Their betrayal also stems from their need to maintain an inflated sense of superiority. They protect this fragile ego by projecting blame, deflecting responsibility, and rewriting the narrative so that they remain the victim or the hero, never the perpetrator. This means even when you gave everything, patience, support, loyalty, they still found ways to diminish it or dismiss it. Not because your love wasn't enough, but because nothing is ever enough for someone who is emotionally hollow. They chase admiration the way someone gasping for breath chases air, but once they get it, they discard it and move to the next source. You were not betrayed because you lacked value. You were betrayed because they lack capacity. And while you're left trying to make sense of the emotional wreckage, they often move on quickly, not because they have found something better, but because they are running from their own emptiness. Their betrayal is a mirror reflecting their instability, their fear of vulnerability, and their inability to sustain authentic connection. Your pain is real, but it does not define you. Their betrayal reveals their truth, not yours. And understanding that is the first step toward reclaiming your sense of worth and grounding yourself again. The moment you stop engaging with a narcissist, something profound and unsettling happens in their world. Their power begins to slip, not because you confront them or expose them, but because you remove the very fuel that keeps their ego alive. Narcissists depend on reaction, your explanations, your emotional responses, your efforts to fix the relationship, your attempts to understand them. Every time you argue back, justify yourself, cry, or try to repair the bond, you are unknowingly giving them the attention and control they crave. They interpret your efforts as proof that they still matter, that they still have influence over your emotions, and that you will continue orbiting around their needs. When you stop participating in this dynamic, something shifts dramatically, and this shift becomes the beginning of their unraveling. Silence, distance, and indifference are deeply destabilizing to them. They expect you to chase, to question, to seek closure. When you stop explaining yourself, they lose the ability to twist your words or manipulate the narrative. When you stop engaging, they lose the emotional leverage they relied on to keep you uncertain and off balance. When you stop rescuing them from the chaos they create, they are forced to confront the emptiness and disorder that define their internal world. Narcissists are not equipped to deal with their own emotional void. They depend on others to regulate their feelings, manage their insecurities, and validate their identity. Without your presence mediating their instability, they feel an immediate sense of loss, panic, and confusion. Your withdrawal disrupts a pattern they never expected to break. They rely on the idea that you will always return, always forgive, always understand. When you choose not to, they experience it as a collapse of control. Control is their lifeline. Without it, the image they've crafted, the confident, desirable, superior self they project, starts to crack. They may scramble to pull you back in using charm, guilt, anger, or feigned vulnerability, but when none of it works, their internal anxiety intensifies. This loss of supply is not just inconvenient for them, it threatens their identity. And as their emotional supply thins out, the consequences begin to surface in their external life as well. They start repeating old patterns with new people, seeking immediate validation to fill the gap you left. But this desperation only accelerates the dysfunction in their relationships. Their behavior becomes more erratic, more demanding, more transparent, because they are acting from fear rather than confidence. They cannot maintain their facade without someone steady and empathetic stabilizing them. The very moment you stop giving them the emotional energy that once sustained them, their life begins to unravel in ways they never saw coming, because the world they built was dependent on your participation, not their strength. Their downfall never comes from revenge, confrontation, or exposure. It comes from losing access to the one thing they depend on more than anything else: your empathy, your stability, and your emotional generosity. Narcissists rarely value these qualities while they have them because they see them as resources rather than gifts. They treat your kindness like a bottomless well, assuming it will always be there to soothe their insecurities, calm their chaos, and make life easier for them. They mistake your patience for weakness and your compassion for obligation. But when you finally step back, when you stop offering the emotional support that once buffered them from their own instability, everything in their life begins to tilt. Your empathy is not something they can replicate. It's not something they can find easily in other people, because authentic empathy requires emotional depth, something they lack. While they may chase admiration and attention, what they cannot secure is genuine emotional safety. You provided that safety unintentionally, often without realizing how much stability you poured into the relationship. You softened their harsh world. You forgave their outbursts, explained their contradictions, and comforted them when their facade cracked. You made their life easier simply by being someone capable of understanding and caring in a way they cannot. Losing that is not just inconvenient for them, it's destabilizing. Your stability acted as a grounding force. Narcissists live in a constant state of internal fluctuation, easily threatened, easily wounded, easily enraged. Your presence created a kind of emotional anchor that they relied on more than they ever acknowledged. You helped them regulate their moods, navigate their insecurities, and smooth over their social missteps. Even though they acted superior, they quietly leaned on your balance whenever their own instability got too loud. When you walk away, the absence of your grounding becomes undeniable. Their emotional swings intensify, their relationships become more volatile, and their ability to maintain their image begins to falter. Your emotional generosity was the glue that held the entire dynamic together. You carried more weight, made more effort, and extended more understanding than they ever did. You forgave things most people wouldn't tolerate. You adapted to situations that constantly drained you. You filled the gap left by their lack of emotional reciprocity. When that generosity is gone, they are forced to confront the truth that they cannot sustain healthy relationships on their own. They will seek out replacements, but replacements cannot give what you gave, because what you offered came from emotional depth, not performance. Their real downfall begins when they realize they lost someone irreplaceable, someone who made their life functional without ever being credited for it. They never imagined losing you would destabilize everything they depended on. Yet this is exactly what happens when your empathy, stability, and emotional generosity are no longer theirs to exploit. With time, something remarkable happens. You begin to rebuild, and they begin to repeat. While your healing might feel slow, heavy, and filled with moments where you question everything, it moves in a direction that leads to growth and clarity. A narcissist, on the other hand, remains stuck in the same destructive loop because they refuse to confront the patterns that cause their relationships to fall apart. What separates your path from theirs is your ability to reflect, feel deeply, and learn from pain. Even though the betrayal wounded you, it also awakened a desire to understand yourself, to protect your boundaries, and to reclaim the parts of you that were overshadowed during the relationship. Your recovery is gradual, but it moves forward. Narcissists are trapped in a cycle they don't recognize. They repeat the same behaviors with new people, thinking the next person will finally admire them enough, tolerate them enough, or never question them. But because they never reflect on their own actions, every new relationship collapses in familiar ways. They idealize, then devalue, then discard, then search for someone else to repeat the pattern. They end up causing the same pain again and again, not realizing they are the common denominator. What feels like fresh beginnings to them are just recycled stages of the same emotional script. Their inability to learn from mistakes becomes their own form of self-destruction. While they repeat, you rebuild. You begin to identify red flags you once overlooked. You strengthen your boundaries. You learn to trust your intuition again. The emotional wounds they left behind motivate you to create a life that is healthier, calmer, and more aligned with your values. Healing doesn't mean forgetting what happened. It means becoming wiser because of it. Each step you take away from their chaos gives you back a piece of yourself. Over time, your life becomes grounded in clarity instead of confusion, self-respect instead of self-doubt. Their life, however, becomes a series of emotional collapses disguised as new beginnings. Because they cannot sustain genuine connection, each new relationship eventually leads to more conflict, more manipulation, and more instability. Their charm wears off quickly, and their patterns become predictable to anyone who gets close enough. Instead of growing, they spiral. Instead of evolving, they defend the same fragile ego. Their lack of self-awareness ensures they repeat the same mistakes that once cost them you. Your healing becomes the ultimate contrast to their stagnation. They lose stability while you regain it. They remain stuck while you move forward. You rebuild a life based on authenticity, while they continue replaying the same cycle, unaware that their repeated sabotage is the true cause of their downfall. Your healing becomes something they never anticipated, a quiet, powerful form of truth that exposes everything they tried to hide about themselves. Narcissists believe they will always have control, influence, or emotional power over the people they once manipulated. They assume their absence will leave you stuck, desperate, or longing for closure. They imagine you will spend your time trying to understand them, waiting for answers, or hoping for validation. What they never consider is the possibility that you might actually heal, detach, and rise beyond the impact of their behavior. That possibility is their greatest fear because nothing destabilizes a narcissist more than losing control and watching someone they underestimated find strength without them. When you start to heal, you disrupt the narrative they created in their mind. They believed you couldn't live without them. They believed their presence defined your happiness. But as you regain your confidence, rebuild your identity, and reconnect with your self-worth, you highlight something they never wanted to face, that they were never the source of your value. Your return to emotional clarity is a silent revelation that their power over you was rooted in your vulnerability, not their superiority. Once that vulnerability transforms into wisdom, their grip dissolves entirely. Healing also exposes the truth of the relationship in a way you couldn't see before. As you grow, you begin to understand the emotional manipulation, the gaslighting, the false promises, and the constant shifts in affection. You start to recognize how much you tolerated, how deeply you cared, and how little they offered in return. This clarity creates an internal closure that doesn't require their apology or acknowledgement. And this independence is something they cannot comprehend. Narcissists depend on others remaining emotionally entangled, confused, or reactive. When you detach emotionally, you take away the very fuel they depended on. Your healing becomes a boundary they can no longer cross. For them, watching you heal is deeply unsettling. It challenges their belief that they are unforgettable, irreplaceable, and superior. It forces them to confront a truth they work hard to avoid, that their behavior does not inspire loyalty, connection, or long-term respect. They may try to re-enter your life, or they may smear you, or they may pretend you never mattered, but none of that stops the reality that your growth highlights their stagnation. Their inability to evolve becomes painfully clear when your transformation reveals what emotional maturity actually looks like. Your healing is not about punishing them, it is about reclaiming yourself. Yet, in reclaiming yourself, you create the very outcome they feared most. Their punishment comes not through your actions, but through your absence, your peace, and your ability to move forward while they remain trapped in the same cycle. Your healing becomes the mirror they cannot bear to look into, and that is why it becomes their silent downfall. In the end, the greatest truth that emerges from this entire journey is that the narcissist never truly destroyed you. They only revealed themselves. Their betrayal, their manipulation, their entitlement, and their emotional emptiness were never reflections of your worth, but symptoms of their own inner fractures. What they assumed would break you instead became the catalyst that strengthened you. While they remain trapped in patterns they refuse to acknowledge, you rise with a clarity and depth they cannot comprehend. You learn, you rebuild, and you become emotionally grounded in ways they never will. The narcissist's greatest miscalculation was believing you would stay small, stay confused, or stay dependent on their version of reality. They underestimated your resilience, your capacity to heal, and your ability to step out of the chaos they created. And as you reclaim your power, something becomes undeniable. Their betrayal did not ruin your life, it ruined their illusion of control. It showed you the truth about them, and it forced them to face the truth about themselves, even if only silently. Your healing, your boundaries, your emotional growth, these become the very things they never anticipated. You move forward not because they changed, but because you did. And in that movement, the balance shifts entirely. You become solid where they remain unstable, whole where they remain fragmented, free where they remain trapped. The closure you find within yourself is the ending they never saw coming. The story does not end with their betrayal. It ends with your transformation.